Greetings, it's Adam with the Rata Non Grata, as well as a site and channel called Arcade Heroes. And so for those of you who are new to the channel, and thanks to those who have subscribed and have been interested in the things that I am covering, such as the Jaguar 2. As I mentioned in that video, it's the Jaguar's 30th anniversary here this year. And being that I also, for a living, operate my own arcade business, and so that's where I've filmed some things from sometimes. I guess some people find that annoying to hear the arcade background. Sorry, I guess. But the nature of owning and operating an arcade generally means that you come across a lot of arcade boards, and given that it's the Jaguar's 30th anniversary, I wanted to take a look at this circuit board right here. And this is what's known as the CoJag. And if you look very carefully here, we'll see if we can get that on camera. Not sure how easy that is to see, but notice it mentions CoJag, and that was designed by Atari Games. And so there is a copyright, so again, maybe a little hard to see, that it mentions copyright 1994. And the main game that most people are familiar with that this was designed for is Area 51. And so the reason why it's called CoJag is because if you look here in the center of the circuit board, you'll notice that it mentions Atari Jaguar. And you have the what it calls the CPU and the DSP there. So these would be your Tom and Jerry chips from the Atari Jaguar game console. So yes, this is an arcadified Atari Jaguar. Now, what is very interesting about this particular board, and this is by my understanding of reading things from, or developer statements from the development of the Jaguar, is that when they were prototyping the hardware, the Jaguar was designed between 1990 and 92. And that's one reason why you'll notice if you look on these chips, you'll see that it mentions copyright 1992 v1.0 right between Atari and Jaguar right there. And so, yeah, that's when the specs were completed. But the prototype Jaguars, they apparently tested out one with a Motorola 68020 and as well as one with a Motorola 68030. But ultimately, I think to save on costs, they went with the Motorola 68000, and that's often a point of criticism as to the design of the Jaguar console. And I've read another person from Atari, I think it was Mark Santora, who had stated that had the Jaguar included this 68020 at least, then it would have been comparable in power to the Sega Saturn. But the reason I bring that up is here on the CoJag, here on this daughter board here, sorry for the jerky J.J. Abrams style shaky cam movement here, but notice this is a Motorola 68EC020. And so with Area 51 in particular, it replaced the Motorola 68000 for that, thus being more in line with the original planned Jaguar console release, or possibly intended one. But another thing that this board adds, aside from all this other I/O stuff that's necessary for arcades, this edge connector you see here is what's called JAMA, which allows it to be plugged into a JAMA wired cabinet, which most games that came out in arcades in the 1990s were JAMA compatible. It was just a wiring standard and such. But this added 4 megabytes, or this had 4 megabytes of RAM instead of 2. And that, what I've also read from the developer statements is that for a while, I guess they were really strongly considering having a design basically just like this without the arcade stuff, and that was with a 68020 and 4 megabytes of RAM. But again, to save costs, they cut out 2 megabytes of RAM and downgraded the CPU, the Motorola CPU there. My friend ECM, who was an editor at GameFan magazine, may his soul rest in peace. He did die a few years ago. I remember him saying that they left half of the Jaguar's brains on the table, referring to how they removed the RAM. But if you want to know what the Jaguar would have been like had they gone with that original spec to not pinch on the pennies, then the CoJag is where it's at. Now, because it is an arcade board and I say I have an arcade, you might be wondering, well, what happens when you plug it in? Well, I actually do not have the hard drive for Area 51 at this time, and so this is what happens if you plug one in without the hard drive for it into a cabinet. I had a cabinet with the light guns, which plugged into these inputs here. The IDE for the hard drive is right here. You can actually get some compact flash cards with an IDE adapter to plug right in there to replace having the old hard drive with, but as you can see, it does boot up. It just needs some software to run. But yeah, that's probably one of the things I should work at building again. A lot of the arcade guns that are out there these days, also known as HAP guns, as if we go over here to my Time Crisis 3, that's these types of guns. Like the original Area 51 did not use those, but there are adapters to swap that out and so that you can use something like that in the event you were interested in building your own Area 51. You would just need a PCB like this. Now, of course, you might be wondering, was there anything else that the Kojag hardware did? Were there any other games created for it? And the answer is yes, there was. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing that gives us the strongest idea of how much more powerful that system was, thanks to the addition of a different chip and more RAM. Of course, Area 51 is an example, but if you go over to System 16 here, click on Atari for the museums, and they have lots of great information here, and not just for Atari, but for many other companies, particularly Sega there. But right here is where you find Atari Kojag. Now, one thing before I click on this to note is that the only game that used the Motorola 68020 in this configuration was Area 51. Other games that were developed for this, although there was only one that was actually completed and released, used the R3000, which also ran at 33 megahertz, and the 68020 ran at 25. But the R3000, you might have heard of that before. That's the CPU that was used in the Sony PlayStation, or the PSX, as we sometimes call it. And so, interesting that they would do that, but as you scroll down here, you can see with Area 51, it mentions again the CPU running at that. And as far as the Jaguar's capabilities goes, you get a pretty good idea of what it could do with Area 51. There was a game called 3-on-3 Basketball that was just a prototype, but nothing about it's ever seemed to have popped up out there, so maybe one of these days somebody will find an image. But one thing to also note on the Jaguar, just due to the way that it was designed, it was not absolutely necessary to even use something like one of the Motorola 68000 series chips. As far as I understand, or from what I've read, is that they were mainly used for things like booting and I/O functions, but you didn't have to operate your game using that chip. Now, some coders did use a lot of code for that chip just because it was so well known and so well documented and relatively bug-free compared to the more buggy Tom and Jerry chips. But Jaguar homebrew coders have discovered that the more of the coding and load that you can put onto the Tom and Jerry chips, the better the software seems to run. Now, that might not be the case on the Kojag, just because this is a full 32-bit processor on the 68 020 or the R3000, and so it wouldn't slow the bus down when it accesses it like the Motorola 68000 would. And of course that was a big problem with having the Motorola 68000 in that original configuration, was that could cause some slowdown there, and it was just slower as well. It was something like 13 megahertz, I think. But if you see here, Area 51 Maximum Force Duo, one of them did come with the 68020, another one with the R3000, and that you might have come across that out there. For another one that was a prototype, and unfortunately most of the games that came out for the CoJag hardware were never actually released. You have Fish and Frenzy, and this one did not use a hard drive. It was ROM based, and I believe that it was kind of like Hungry Shark. It would have been a very early version of Hungry Shark, but one of the things that the Jaguar hardware was good at was 2D sprites, and that was originally what it was designed for. It was designed for that more than it was 3D, and so this one could have pushed a lot of pre-rendered sprites and all that. And then there was Freeze, which would have come out in 1996, and this was a puzzle game, a matching puzzle game. Now there are the ROMs for this do exist, and Galloping Ghost Arcade over in Brookfield, Illinois has this on site. So if you wanted to play this, you could do it there. If you wanted to play it on original hardware, it's also available on through emulation and whatnot. I'm not sure how far along that was, but obviously it's not an impressive game that would show you what the system was capable of. And then in 1997 was when Maximum Force came out, and this wouldn't be a sequel to Area 51 in that it wasn't set in that it wasn't in that setting or that universe. The board set was called Jackhammer, but it was still powered by the Atari Jaguar's original chips and all that. And so I've only played it once or twice, and it's been a very long time since I have. And again, it was released in a duo configuration. And then last but not least was Vicious Circle. This was a one-on-one fighter, as you can tell, and here's some footage from Video Game Esoterica that shows this, and it was trying to be Killer Instinct, but Atari had a hard time in the late 90s after Primal Rage came along, and I have that arcade board too, but after Primal Rage, just the market, the bottom kind of fell out of the fighters market. I mean, yeah, Capcom was still able to push that and milk that for a while, but companies like Atari were finding that they just, what the type of fighters they were designing, people weren't really interested in. And so Primal Rage 2 was in development about the same time, but it was on different hardware. It was on actually PlayStation-based hardware, and that got canned, and Vicious Circle got canned, and so just Atari Games was never really good at handling fighting games. And so one thing that I would like to throw out there is, I mean, I've long been curious as to what could the Kojag hardware do? What would happen if you were to port one of the existing Jaguar games over to it, and if it had any Motorola 68000 code, like using the 68020 or the R3000, what more could you do with it? Like, how would Battlemore for Iron Soldier 2 or 05 or Tempest 2000 run? I mean, obviously with some of those games they wouldn't work in an arcade setting, although I've long thought that Atari Corporation with the Trammels and Atari Games should have got together in 94 or 95 and did Tempest 2000 arcade. That just would have made sense to me. I mean, it was based on an arcade game anyways, and that would have been fantastic to have that in arcades with a proper arcade quality spinner controller. But another thing to throw out there, if there are any coders who know the Jaguar really well, is I would love to see homebrew efforts come along for this, not just to push the hardware, but it's an opportunity for any homebrew coders, if they wanted to create a game that could go into arcades, I mean, you could either release it in a ROM set or as a compact flash image that you could sell to plug into these, and so that way you could convert Area 51s over to whatever game it is that you wanted on there. And so there are indie developers out there who have done stuff like that. NG Dev Team has done a lot of homebrews for the Neo Geo MVS hardware, and so that's been interesting. Of course, they've moved on to bigger, better things, and they're mainly doing stuff for the Switch now. But there's quite a few who've done stuff like that for the Neo Geo, and it would be cool to see some homebrew efforts make their way to arcades, because people like me, if the game's good and it's developed with arcades in mind, then we would buy them and we would put them in our arcades. And you could also charge more than you do for an Atari Jaguar cartridge. Now, of course, I don't know how many potential sales would be out there, but there were several thousand Area 51 units sold, several thousand maximum force units as well. It didn't sell quite as well as Area 51 did, but you know, there are a few boards out there, and so there is somewhat of a market. And with all the retrocades that are out there, they might be interested if you could come up with the right concept. You can't take a straight game like if you took Battle Morph and brought it into arcades, that wouldn't work. You would have to change certain things about it. You can't allow the player to sit there and nothing happen. You know, that's where sometimes timers come into play or something else to force the player into action. But the more action-packed an arcade game is, the better it does, generally speaking. But of course, there always is a risk in arcades when you release a brand new game on old hardware. Will anybody play it? Well, that's a good question, but I wouldn't mind testing it out since I have this Kojag board sitting here. I really wouldn't mind giving that a shot to see what goes, again, with the right game, because not every game does work. But yeah, what could the Kojag do? Maybe one day we'll find out. Even a tech demo would be cool, just to see how far it might be able to be pushed, especially if you could compare it on Jaguar hardware and then compare on Kojag hardware, how that demo would operate. But obviously games are better than demos, or particularly tech demos. What do you think about this? Have you played Area 51 before or any of these other Kojag games? Let me know in the comments, and we'll see you on the next video.